Hello, friends. Welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly podcast where we explore the 2,000-year-old Catholic intellectual tradition. I'm Dr. Benjamin Smith, lecturer in philosophy with Catholic Studies Academy. Very excited today to have two guests with us. Joe Grossheim, who's been with us before as a student at the Center for Thomistic Studies in Houston, Texas. And for the first time appearing on our podcast, Phillip Berns, another student, graduate student at the Center for Thomistic Studies in Houston, Texas. I guess it's a good place, huh?
Seems like it, yes.
Seems like it. I know. As a matter of fact, I'm a graduate from the Center for Thomistic Studies. Look at that! Wow, this is the center. There's a theme here, right? We're really excited to have you guys on today to talk about sort of the intersection of philosophy and economy, and Philip's sort of interest in sort of his dissertation, I think, that he's working on here, right, is focused on the idea of a humane economy or developing a humane economy. Phil, why don't you just get started by talking a little bit about yourself? What's your interest, your background? What are you up to?
Good. Thank you, Dr. Smith. Well, first of all, again, it's a pleasure for me to be here. So thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. So my particular background, at least regarding philosophy, it started when I was in the seminary while I was back in New Orleans.
Okay.
And that's when I first started. When I discerned out of formation, I started teaching. After I'd been teaching for a while, I made my way to Houston for my PhD in philosophy. It was just something I really got into while I was in priestly formation.
Sure. Yeah.
But it was around when I first started getting into the notion of like economics was around 2014. And it was the first time that I went up to the Acton Institute summer conference.
Okay, interesting, right.
2014. And so that's when I really started kind of being exposed to, I guess, a wider element of these ideas. And I've kind of kept going back, I've picked up numbers of books and articles and all that over the years. And I've just I used to think about it for fun until I needed a dissertation topic. Right?
Sure.
So I was all right. I think I can do this. Kind of reading the lay of the land. I sort of see sort of a general map, and I think certain issues and problems that maybe I've come to identify that I think a really solid Thomistic Aristotelian interpretation of these notions, I think, can resolve some of the tensions, or at least tensions and different approaches that I think that I've seen kind of over the years.
That's great. And what are you doing professionally right now? Excellent. Besides being a graduate student?
Besides being a graduate student. So I am very fortunate now. I'm one of the founding faculty at the Collegium Sanctorum Angelorum in Hagerstown, Maryland.
That's awesome.
It's been very, very awesome. We are right now still the only 4-year liberal arts college that's geared ordered towards the formation for traditional Catholic families. We kind of looked around. Maybe we'll talk about entrepreneurship in a little bit, but look around and see that there's this need that seems to not be met anywhere else. And a lot of these liberal arts high schools that are kind of coming into the forefront, a lot of them don't have a place to continue that sort of formation, especially within a certain type of liturgical preference, let's say. And so that's been awesome. We're in our second year of operation here in Maryland. We have applications coming in even for next year. So it's been very, very good. Very pleased to be a part of this.
That's great. It sounds like an exciting project.
It has been.
You mentioned the Acton Institute, Phil, and that's one of those. The Acton Institute has is a I would say a player, right? It's a key institution, I would say, in the American Catholic Church in particular, but sort of broadly in this sort of ongoing discussion, I think, that goes on in our circles, Catholic intellectual circles, about economics. And the best, you could say, maybe the form of economic practice that's most consistent, say, with Catholic faith. Now, we're not going to take a theological approach here. We're going to be focused on philosophy, but still, that's part of the discussion, right? In a full-orbed Catholic sort of intellectual debate. And I would say I think there are good folks, good people on both sides in this issue. There's some people who are more critical of free markets and capitalism, and some who are, more in favor of free markets and capitalism. Interestingly, often I find this a really fun part of it. Interestingly, a lot of them appeal to Aristotle and Thomas on opposite sides. Right?
This is true.
Which is, to me, that makes a really good debate, right?
Yes.
When you have both sides claiming to be Aristotelian and
Yeah.
Thomist, right?
However,
And nevertheless, they are, sort of proposing different theses. That's not universally the case, but at least that's certainly a lot of people refer to Aristotle and Thomas and their work on this matter. Would you mind, Phil, just kind of giving us a lie of the land here? Like, who are the major, what are the major positions? Maybe some people who represent those positions. Like, how do they agree, disagree? A little bit of a taxonomy.
Yes. So in general, I think for maybe our purposes here, I'll distinguish, let's just say three major positions, and I'll leave one off in the secular sphere. In the secular sphere, you have still the basic distinction between, we'll put the Marxism on one side, so socialism, communism, and kind of their academic adherents, and you have the sort of neoclassical. So it kind of can be the combination then of Keynesianism, the Austrian economics, the Chicago School economics, which all of those sort of identified themselves really in opposition to Keynesianism, whatever, and that's kind of going on in the secular sphere. In sort of our circles, Catholic intellectual circles, you do have players like the Acton Institute that's sort of on the side of, we can call them free markets. So they tend to lean more towards, you can call it capitalism, although I suppose we will have to clarify that term, right?
I think that's important.
It is. So for the moment, let's leave it at free markets, but coupled with a sort of substantial view of human flourishing, right? That recognizing that this isn't just for the pursuit of money, it's actually about human well-being. Right? But they see the market mechanism as being the best way to sort of achieve that end. On the other hand, in sort of Catholic intellectual circles, you have they kind of are known as the distributist school, right? And this was popularized and kind of originates with thinkers like Chesterton and Belloc, and it comes into sort of the popular thinkers now, Thomas Thorpe, John Mackay. And they have, and I want to interpret, as charitably as possible, a more top-down sort of approach, a more centralized governmental approach concerning the distribution of property. Right? Not incorrectly, they do view that human good or individual's good is probably best pursued when they are in control of the means of production to look after their own well-being. Right? So to maybe put to maybe make this distinction, then they don't trust something like the free market mechanism as much as somebody, let's say, from the Acton Institute would, or something like that. For the distributists, there's a more active role for the state in actually directing individuals and groups to their good, right? And that's sort of where that distinction comes from.
Okay. Gotcha. And then you said there was well, just to clarify here, with the sort of capitalist pro-market sort of approach here, it is connected, say in your own mind, or I guess in the mind of its proponents, with an idea of human flourishing, right? Now, do they see that like as I'm kind of curious about how they see that relationship. Is it that in pursuing human flourishing, you will favor free market approaches to economy because you're virtuous or something like that? Or is this more of a means to an end kind of thing, where as in it's good to have free market solutions here? And we should probably just say something what you mean exactly by free market. We should opt for free market solutions usually because if they're more productive of virtue. I don't know that necessarily not productive of virtue, or facilitate or foster,
or even to the question of virtue. That would be interesting to think about for a second. But certainly the favoring of the market mechanism is because it seems to be the most efficient and the most productive way to achieve at least the material element of human flourishing. It's the best way to achieve prosperity, material prosperity.
And some people, I imagine, think that is the extent of human flourishing.
This is true.
What do you think?
Well, obviously I would disagree with that. But this goes back to, okay, when you talk about then, all right, what is that notion of human flourishing? And you go through some of those questions Aristotle lays out at the beginning of the Ethics, right? Is the human good found in something like just the pursuit of money? Right? And that's true. There are a lot of people around still today that actually still hold that view, right? It's what Elon Musk has been making all the news, at Twitter and stuff like that. But one of the things he's known for is a sort of like work mentality, right? You work nights, weekends, like you kind of, it's a live to work, right? And well, if you see the human good as being purely material, then that mindset makes sense. But if you kind of, and this is what Aristotle brings to the table, when you see that, well, money is just a means to some further end, and so obviously it's not sought for its own sake, well, then you have to start asking the questions of, all right, fine, what am I working for? What is the, right? And that's when you have to start developing a real notion of human good. Right? So that's kind of how, I would think about that.
Now, on the other side of this with the distributists, how would they see the relationship between human flourishing and their sort of preferred economics? So if you want to say again, that in many cases, a distributist would say something like, well, tell it, why are they called distributists? That would help.
Yeah. So they take their name from their starting principle is from the standpoint of distributive justice, right? So they take, and this seems to be, this is where Aristotle starts out. This is general justice in what book 5, right, of the Ethics. And he starts with this principle of the distribution of the common material goods in society. And the first kind of common material good in society is at least the land, right? That everybody has, and so that this should be justly distributed among the citizens, followed by other forms of property, right? Variously defined. Okay, and so that's their starting point with the notion of distribution. Okay, I'll come back maybe later to why I don't think that that's the best starting point, but this is where at least they take their name from. Now, kind of how they approach this issue, the way that at least that I've read them. So we talked a bit about how a number of these various followers of Thomas and Aristotle, we all kind of cite back to Thomas and Aristotle, right? So what the distributists see, and again, not wrongly, they see this rightly. We know, and I don't know how far some of maybe our listeners might be familiar with the distinction of the speculative and practical sciences.
Why don't you go ahead and explain for us?
So we know that the speculative sciences, or where it takes their name from, is the truths of these sciences are just to be looked at, specula, right, and to be contemplated. And these are like the truths of nature, the truths of mathematics, the truths of metaphysics, right? There's nothing you can do with this knowledge. It's just perfective of the intellect to know about the world, right? Its causes and principles and the way that things are, right? It's the knowledge of the way that things are. The practical sciences and the arts, on the other hand, concern those things that can be done by human agents or made by human agents, right? And so they rightly see, and even knowing that distinction, you start to get the general feel that, of course, economics falls under the practical science part, right? It concerns then how human beings go about trying to pursue their right. Now the good for human being, that's given by the science of the human person, right? The philosophy of the person, one of the speculative sciences, right? But how you go about adapting means to ends in the pursuit of that, right? It's even in that sort of definition. It's how you adapt this, it's how you do this, right? It's how you make market functions, things like this. So clearly this sort of falls into the practical science and art distinction here. And so what the distributists see then is, given that that's the case, they stand back and they would say something like, well, we know that the good of the human person, right, the reason that they work, right, is to produce some of the right food, clothing, shelter, the things that are at least materially necessary so that they can go on for a well-lived life, right? And then given that's the case, where I think they start to trip up, right, is in then sort of discounting the sort of structure that is inherent within economics itself, right, that we come to see through the centuries of looking at the way human beings interact in this fashion. but they would say, well, we know that the human good consists in something like a concrete question is the living wage, right?
Sure. Okay.
A lot of distributists that I know, or some that I've spoken to, they would favor something like a mandated minimum wage because this is just what it takes to live well.
Right.
Right.
Gotcha.
And fine. Like I get on the level of principle, I understand that they're seeing this correctly. Where I think they start to mess up, where the rubber hits the road, as it were, is in discounting some of the proper mechanisms. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so it's been pretty well documented, I think, but you can go through the list of, well, when governments mandate minimum wage, that usually doesn't turn out the way that you wanted it to.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
It often has an even counterintuitive effect and actually can make things worse. Right.
That's right.
Not all the time, but
Mhm.
in enough
Often.
times that it's often enough that it's worth
Mhm.
commenting upon.
Right. So the key difference I see here as you explain this is that, you know, the distributists want, they recognize that, say, a living wage is a necessary part of human flourishing.
True.
Or something like a living wage. And therefore, we're going to have it or something like it distributed by the political authority
Mm-hmm.
or the means to it, right,
Mm-hmm.
to the parts of the political community. Yeah. Whereas the other side is going to might also say, yeah, we do need a living wage in order to flourish, but we're going to trust the mechanism of the free market to distribute that. So you have a free market creating the distribution of the means to living well, mm-hmm. versus a command structure, right?
Yes.
Towards the
and that
means
it seems
to living
to be, well. Yeah, and that it seems to be, or at least generally speaking, again, there are always exceptions in terms of practicalities, mm-hmm. But that generally it's the most efficient and most productive way of achieving this end, with also, and this is important too, the least amount of what economists will call the unintended consequences of your mm-hmm. action. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's what I think a lot of when you start looking at the appropriate structure, the proper structure of economics itself, mm-hmm. a lot of it tends to look at that aspect too, which is mm-hmm. why command economies or more centralized economies, they tend to just be practically not very effective, is because there are always unintended consequences that you don't see, mm-hmm. can't foresee, right? Markets are too big. There are too many agents interacting, right? Mm-hmm. And anything that you do is going to have ramifications down the road, right? And very often kind of an overexertive centralized mm-hmm. authority isn't as effective as you might think at the outset, right? There's certainly a role for it. And this is, again, where I would also part ways with the libertarians, right? Who, even the ones who do recognize something resembling some sort of human good, they tend sometimes, as Joe, you mentioned, maybe to see material flourishing as just the end, right? And mm-hmm. and then it's just this sort of completely hands-off, free markets are the best ways to make money, and that's what this mm-hmm. is for. So you just let people have at it, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And I think clearly you also then have to see that if economics is about human action, and we know human actions proceed from a deliberate will, mm-hmm. and will is towards the good, right? That's what subjects all of this to moral consideration, to moral mm-hmm. judgment. And so I think you have to part ways with the libertarians there as well.
Sure. I think this is worth dwelling on. Okay. It's a good question. I think most people are familiar with, and I think most people will see that there is at least a strong possibility for this sort of top-down overreach problem that you're mm-hmm. pointing out. But I think a lot of people will struggle to see how we could turn to a free market as any sort of help. It seems like a very haphazard way to go about securing the material needs for human flourishing.
Yeah, something that's necessary, right? So important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is interesting, and so one of the things I've kind of been thinking about for a little bit. One of the first thoughts I've had on this, there are two things I would say. First, it seems to me, and I haven't done much more work in refining this argument than the last time we talked about it, but I think the general argument still holds that the natural state of market economies is a free one. And I argue something along the lines of, so you guys are familiar, but maybe we might need to summarize, right? Aristotle argues that the polis, the city, is natural because it's necessary to for human beings to achieve their common good, their true good. Right? It's not something that they can achieve on their own. They need this sort of assistance of the city to achieve this good. And Aristotle argues that anything that's necessary for the achievement of a natural end is itself natural. Okay. Well, we know, and I think so. This parallel case, right? We know that most people are not able to produce for themselves, right? Even people that have their own farms and stuff like that, right? They're not able to produce for themselves all that they need, even materially, for their well-lived life.
Sure.
So, given that this is the case, they either have to produce it themselves, which most people can't, or they have to barter, trade, or exchange in order to acquire those things that they do need, right? And sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. Right. And so this is that first stage of the kind of market, right? Is I know that I can't, so obviously for a well-lived life, you need good pipe tobacco, like Dr. Smith is utilizing currently. Right now, am I correct in assuming that you don't grow your own tobacco?
No, this is grown in Virginia.
Right? Yeah, right. So you have to then do something. You have to produce something either that can be traded directly or that traded for a medium, money, right? That can then be used to do this, right? Okay. But this all has, so not every, you might not have something that just anybody else needs. They might not have something that just, or just anybody might not have the things that you need, right? And so on. Where I'm going is then this sort of this natural market of association where you can go with your product and go, well, I know that I need this. What's this series of exchanges that I need to make to get to the end, right?
Sure.
And and that requires a sort of natural freedom on the part of the agent.
Okay, so I have an objection here. A counter to this. What you've argued for, and I think correctly, and I've done so, I use this kind of argumentation to try to demonstrate the inadequacy of the family, which sounds bad at first, but you get the point, right? Or the village, if you prefer. Really, all that you're really arguing, though, for here is the division of labor. You're demonstrating the necessity of divided labor. It doesn't follow that has to be freely exchanged. Right. You could have a command economy in which, we distribute the jobs out and, Joe is the farmer and I'm the overseer and Philip makes shoes. I like that arrangement there. So, and, and, we all get what we need. Right. But, because we need food, we need shoes, we need somebody to oversee things. So we all get what we need, but not through a free exchange. Yeah, not through a voluntary exchange.
Okay, so this brings me then to this sort of second point that I was going to make. Right. All right. So first, you have here. So the one I wonder if this is significant, but it might not be for the purposes of your objection, because the market arises prior to any sort of political authority. Right. I mean, the market arises at the level of the village, prior to prior to the state, prior to any sort of control. But that might not be relevant, so I'll leave it aside.
Maybe, yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, we could come back.
So I'll leave it aside. Okay, but you have the first notion of so when Thomas talks about when agents act for an end, right? This is one of the first places he mentions this notion of human freedom.
Okay.
Right? Is that you have to be determined towards some end in order to act, right? If you're not determined more to this end rather than that end, then you just wouldn't do anything at all. Okay. But that means that you have to have the understanding of the end that in a certain sense is proper to you. All right. So you know how much pipe tobacco you need. You know how many shoes that you need for your household, something like that, right? You know how many shirts, blah, 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 right? Something that's not suited to be distributed by a command economy, right? This is part of that knowledge problem that some of the neoclassical economists do write about, right? Is so that there are too many moving parts and there are too many individual agents who need enough different things that this is not well coordinated from a central location. it's one of the, so Mary Hirschfeld, a Harvard economist, talks about this sort of counterintuitive central insight. And again, this is repeated by, this is Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations makes this remark. She makes this remark. Novak, Samuel Gregg, Thomas Sowell. I mean, this is sort of a well-recognized point, and this is where I come to. That sort of material flourishing, empirically, and this is the question, right? When you're dealing about these sort of practical questions, then you look at how this turns out, right?
Okay.
Are the command-centered economies that we've seen, do they tend to get the job done when it comes to getting resources to the people who need them?
Okay.
When you look around at the history of command economies, the answer to that seems to be they don't seem to be that good at it. Right? On the other hand, when you look at market mechanisms, right, for whatever else you would want to say about it, and there are certainly a good number of legitimate criticisms that can be leveled against the market mechanism, right? Don't shy away from that. But also, nowhere else do you see the many being enriched the way they've been, other than the market mechanism. And it seems to be because it's this odd, right? So Smith, and he's been kind of ridiculed for it, but Adam Smith came up with that term, the invisible hand, right? And yeah, he's been ridiculed by others throughout the ages.
Can you explain that to me real quick?
Yeah. So it was the idea, really, all that I'm trying to explain is that given individual action, right? When each individual agent acts for their particular good, it actually turns out that the good of the whole is sort of accidentally pursued as well.
Okay.
And that's what he means. It's almost like there's this invisible hand sort of guiding the rest of it, right? If I'm pursuing what's good for me, and Joe, you're pursuing what's good for you, and Dr. Smith, what's good for you.
What's really
actually
good, right?
This is true, right?
Yeah,
and yeah, you do have to qualify for that. But even if you wanted to just take it down to the level of material prosperity for a second, right? If I'm just trying to get rich, and you're trying to get rich, and you're trying to get rich, it actually, if everybody in the city's doing this, the city's going to be quite wealthy. Right. It just seems to happen, not necessarily, but as a sort of accidental, sort of an accidental consequence, right? But it's true that the same would happen if, Joe, as you just mentioned, right? If you have a true notion of the good, right? That if each agent is pursuing what's truly good, then sort of per accidens, the good of the whole gets pursued as well.
This is what I was just thinking. I think that's important to that we have to be pursuing what's really good, because if I'm not, and I'm really just trying to enrich myself,
yeah,
and I have no other limitations,
yep,
I can enrich all three of us as long as we enslave 1,000 people each, right? So
sure.
Like
it doesn't even have to be that extreme either, but yeah.
Well, it doesn't,
sure.
Yeah. But like, there's lots of ways.
You just use child labor. Let's do that one.
Yeah, well, yeah, all right. We can use child labor or whatever, right? Sweatshops or whatever you like. But it seems like without any sort of moral limitations on it,
this is true.
I could bring much wealth into the city, but it would be consolidated in the hands of a few. And I think a lot of folks have a problem with that.
Yeah. Right. And this is why. So, okay. Right. So yeah, you bring up an excellent point, and that's right. Right. Because if we end up pursuing something that's not truly good, then yeah, the city might be materially prosperous, but it's going to be morally rotten. It's going to be morally corrupt. And you're going to have, very much like people have mentioned, the sort of mentality that's very pervasive in our culture today, right? You have an entire generation of younger workers who, they say, right? I mean, like, for them, the American dream, it's gone, right? They were told that, hey, all you have to do is go to college, get a job, and you'll be successful, right? And now they're burdened with so much debt. The prices of everything is just going right through the roof, right? And there's this general, and even though materially, it's stupid how prosperous this country is, right?
Right.
But morally, I think everybody, even on the people that, even on the level of those who don't necessarily see a connection of ethics with politics, the way we see it, even they recognize that something is empty, right? Even, and this was a 2018 book, but they even talk about the subtitle being "Our Empty Economy." right? It's sort of known. And so, all right, so to your point, right, if we're not pursuing what's truly good, then you're right, right? Then the rest of this, it actually ends up sort of corrupting the whole system, which is sort of the central point I'm trying to like bring back in my own thinking, my own writings. When you have authors like, Michael Novak and Samuel Gregg, all these guys, they explicitly say, I mean, I'm almost using their exact words, right? That truly free markets cannot function outside of a virtuous or ethical society. And you read that and you're like, wow, that's really insightful. And then they go on to not talk at all about how these virtues and morals are actually derived, right? It's completely separated from what we would call a formal notion of the common good. Right. Some of them stick with a very material definition of the common good, right? And like, okay, that's good, but that's only half of the story, right? If we're not actually using, and maybe this is the next point I'll say, but I don't want to dominate the conversation, but if you're using a mechanism, the mechanism also has to be used well.
Right, sure.
Because it's possible to misuse a mechanism, right?
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of this, that's where a lot of these tensions come from.
Yeah, that's good. So I think, gosh, there's so much here.
There is. Can I to wrap up? So I was talking about the distinction between the practical sciences, speculative sciences, and the arts. And this is one of the, it's kind of funny. Father Shaw says in his book, you shouldn't talk about something before you've written it down, because then you've talked, the drive to write it will have been spent in the talk, but I'm about to talk about something I haven't written yet. So, but this was something I was reading in Charles McCoy, right, who's great political Thomist, for if any of the, the structure of political thought. But one of the things he first starts out with is this notion of the practical sciences and the arts and so on. Okay. In the practice, so I've said in the speculative sciences, whose truths are just to be contemplated, right? The standard of truth is in the conformity of the intellect with the way that things are, right? To think about things as they are. In the practical sciences, the standard of truth is in the right will of the agent. You have to be willing what's good. For the arts, though, the standard is in the excellence of the thing made. And Thomas goes through this in the commentary on the Boethius de Trinitate, right? Question 5. The upshot of this, and this is where I think a lot of people miss, is that economics has a foot in both camps, right? As a form of human action pursuing their good, it has a foot in practical science, and as such is subject to the moral will of the agent. You have to be willing what's properly good. But as an art, considering the making of the market system and stuff, like, it's also judged by the excellence of the system. And you have to have both of these things. Economics is judged not only by the right intention of the agents, right? Because you can have people intending the good all day long who are just tripping over themselves, messing everything up. It's also judged by the excellence of the system, right? This has to be an efficient way of getting resources to the people who need them. But on the other hand, you can't just judge it by that standard either, right? Because you can have a very efficient system. As Joe pointed out, though, it can be very efficient at concentrating resources in the hands of a few as well. Right? So you've got to have both of those things.
Sure. That's a good way of hashing it out. There's some technical questions I think about the nature of the sciences there. Maybe we can come back to at the end if we have time. But I think very important there, right? So, you've got the excellent execution, right? And then the intention of the proper end, right? Of the good, right? Now, I do think in matters of action, right? The question of the end is predominant, because even judging efficiency, right? The relative value of efficiency and the boundaries, right, about what is going to be allowed as effective practice, right, are going to be drawn by the end, I think, right? So we can't decide we're just going to enslave a fifth of the population of our own citizens just because it would actually be efficient. We'll just do a lottery, whatever. So, maybe I don't know if that'd be efficient or not, but whatever. Just say it was. So I guess I want to challenge here a little bit. you feel on this, then if we have a clear articulation of the common good, right? And I think that's actually vital here, because even if some exchange happens beforehand, I do take political community to be architectonic with respect to all of these activities.
Yeah, the first of the causes is the last.
That's right. Yeah. And so it has to be brought, I think, clearly into view. Now, my own view or definition of it is something like, and I'm not particular about this, you could have a somewhat different, but I think this is the pretty close to the right answer. Is it involves the production and exchange of the virtuous production and exchange of bodily goods, right? That is the subject matter of the cardinal virtues, right? Is what's proper to the city, right, and proper to political community, right? Bodily goods can be everything from marriage, right, to food, right, and defense and things of that nature, right? So if that's true, right, then a system might be efficient abstracting from that, right? If we're going to have not just a material, but a formal definition. But in comparison to that end, still inferior, right? To something that's less efficient materially, at least as that seems possible. I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here, right? In other words, I might grant you that absent the formal character of the common good, that free market exchange is more efficient, right, at producing material prosperity. But once we bring in the formality of it, namely that it has to be just and virtuous, then even though capitalism is more efficient, it's less good, right? And that the distribution, albeit less efficient, how about this, is efficient enough. So let me give you a couple of examples of command economy that maybe we haven't considered. My family is run on a command economy.
Yeah.
We don't compete for goods and services within my family. I distribute them. Yes. Right. Okay. This is true of every father, right? Within his own family, right?
And all the wealth is consolidated in the hands of a few.
That's right. That's right. There's no competition for goods. I mean, it's just, no, right? So there's that. Let's think about one of the things that got an interesting example people don't sometimes bring in. And this was actually a problem in the Middle Ages. The Cistercians were really good at being communist farmers, right? They became very wealthy. This is a real problem, right? And that because they were actually really good at running their communal farms, right? And tended to beat out the nearby laymen, which kind of pissed them off, right? And made the local lords kind of angry, right? Because they were acquiring more property through, I would say, maybe some concentration of resources, better accounting, things, whatever it is, right? So there's another example. Another example of command economy is the military, right? Military distributes goods and services in a command structure. Is it super efficient? Probably not. Is it efficient enough for the purpose? Right. And here's the thing is that a commander on the battlefield doesn't really care if he had to pay $10 more for the toilet than he should have. Sure. What he wants to make sure is the shells are here when I need them. Right. Not did I get them at that best cost? Do you follow me? Right. Now that's maybe, I don't know, there's a lot of things you could say about that. Right. But I could. So if I was to kind of give an abstract account of what I'm saying is, maybe I'm willing to give up a little high-end efficiency for a higher floor.
Sure.
Right. And so, I'm willing to say, this isn't the most efficient distribution system, but given what the common good demands in terms of virtue, it's actually injustice. It's actually going to accomplish the end better, even if it's not as cost effective.
Yeah, and I don't think that
Does that make sense? What I'm trying to.
I wonder if I can ask a question, Dr. Smith, because I think we have the same question, and maybe I can sum it up. I was thinking as you were speaking earlier, Phil, that you said that economics has its foot in these two arenas, that it's both a techne and a practical science, and that it's for the sake of some good, and the good is then measuring the techne, is the way I'm understanding it. And so I think what Dr. Smith is asking, and at least what I was wondering, is how far of a correction can that good as a measure make on your techne, on your system, right? Could the demands of the common good be such that it precludes market economy, even though market economy is more efficient at material welfare? It, in pursuing material welfare, fails to secure the full formality of the common good. Is that what you're asking, Dr. Smith?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
I mean, I would just say, the only qualification is maybe we have a scale here of free market to distribute, but
Yeah.
But that's fine.
Yeah. And that's the first thing. Anytime you're dealing with just something that's on a scale and you're dealing with matter of degree, that's going to be a little more difficult. So I suppose to maybe think of this in terms of generalities, because you both bring up a lot of points. Well, the first thing I wonder too, so Dr. Smith, you started with like the notion of your family, right? Every family is a command economy, and it kind of should be that way, actually. And there are reasons for that. Even the military to a certain extent, but all of these differ from the city. All of these differ from the polis by the nature of their order and composition.
Sure.
Right. So like this is why this is like the mistake of like Hobbes, right? We do not all compose the Leviathan, the state, the way that a family is composed, right? And so you have more there. And I suppose too, because families are primarily for the production and the training of non-free agents, if you want to call them, right?
Yeah, or agents who should not rightly be left to their own devices.
Yeah, agents who should not be left to their own devices. This is what the family is for, right? But that's what it's for. The polis, though, the city, this is an association of free and self-governing agents, or at least, right, on Aristotle's kind of conception of the polis, right, of self-governing. This is what he means by free people, right? Those who are capable of a certain level of virtue such that they are self-governing, right, and therefore can be rightly directed by a good regime, right? This is that notion. And so that very dynamic, I think, is also it's going to have ramifications then for the way that these free and self-governing agents sort of do have to interact and do have to compete for goods. And I'll push back only for the sake of the argument, right? You talk actually in your family, they do compete for goods. You just have to decide who needs more, right? Who actually needs the goods that you're distributing. But see, your family's small enough that you can do that, right? You actually are in a position that you know the needs of everyone in the family, right? This is why that works well in families. But I mentioned like the knowledge problem earlier, right? Just as a practical matter, a state is far too large, right? I mean, Aristotle put a limit of what, about 100,000 people on the. I think he would die from laughter at the thought of the Republic of the United States having 350 million people. He would no, right? That's just too large. There is no committee that could be large enough, that could function quickly enough to get all of those data points together to determine who needs what, right? And this is why in command economies, you see stockpiled goods going to waste while other people aren't getting things that they need, period. Right? That's a problem of scale, right? Something that does work at the level of family, right? Doesn't work at the level of the state. Right? And part of it is that dynamic of the agents that are doing the acting, right? So yeah, so I guess Joe, to then your point, we were trying to summarize, right? Yeah, the notion of what's truly good does provide a check on that mechanism. The mechanism is just there, like any other mechanism that tells you, right, if this is a good that you want to pursue, this is how you would do it. So I talk, right, okay, so like I'm here at the Collegium in Maryland, right? We're a liberal arts college. Arguably, we would be much more materially successful, right, if we were a trade school. Right, there seems to be a much higher demand among like younger students, whatever, if we were a trade school, right?
Successful
However,
in a certain sense, at least.
materially successful,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Money. We would be on much more financially stable ground if we were a trade school.
Right.
But we recognize, like, kind of in the sort of the length of the Catholic intellectual tradition, right, that there are higher goods to be pursued, right? That even at the end of the day, whether, plumber, welder, whatever, there is still the sake of a well-lived life, right? And what do you do when you get home, right? Why is something like your family and spending time with them, why is that important? Why is just looking up at the stars at night, why is that meaningful? Why is good literature important? Blah, 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 right? It's because we're committed to that idea, right? That sort of notion of a higher good. Actually, again, it kind of provides that a little bit of that check on our mechanism of how we go about even recruiting students, how we market, how we do things like that, right? So certainly the notion of the good provides a check on the mechanism. The mechanism is just there as a mode of the efficiency of the best way to achieve whatever the end is. Right? And that's why, yeah, sure.
Okay. So I think that's right. And I think I'm thinking through the ethics here. And you remember Milo the wrestler? He's one of my favorite examples in Aristotle. He's so Milo the wrestler needs more calories than Joe Grossheim, the graduate student, right? And so he has a different eating regimen than I do. Yeah. And I'm wondering if certain economies need a different economic system than other economies, because you're looking at a good, you have a good in mind, and you have to select the appropriate means to achieve that good. And different political societies, or different societies, let me say that, different societies are different materially and perhaps different formally, and those differences might require a different system in order to achieve perhaps the same end or perhaps the different ends, right? So I was thinking about Dr. Smith's examples. The military has a very certain end, which is would be frustrated by a market economy, right? The family the same way, but perhaps in addition, the family is materially different because the kids are not suited to compete with each other over who gets to eat a sandwich and who doesn't, so there could be material and formal differences, or differences in terms of telos or final causality, that would separate out which system works. But I wonder if we can say that in every polis, wherever, that a freer market economy is going to be the better system, or do we have to step back and be willing to say that some political societies are so different that they might require something more on the side of a command economy?
Yeah. I think on the one hand, on the level of principle, I think you would have to grant something like that, especially if you were to take, so I've got some of the guys that I've cited already, like Michael Novak, Samuel Gregg, like their very words that like a market economy can only survive in a virtuous society. Like, well, gee, maybe that's why things aren't working out so well. I don't think, right? This is
right.
So, okay, so what kind of market or what kind of economic structure, because there are different kinds of markets after all, right? So what kind of structure then do you have in a less than virtuous society? And it's okay, right? And this is why I kind of wonder about this, this notion about economics, again, being something of a practical science and an art, right? So coming back to distinction I made before, but coupled with what you were just saying. One wonders, and you talk about thinking through the ethics. I'm one of those people so I read the ethics as a whole. I actually think so that Aristotle's putting forward a vision that you have to have a certain amount of material wealth, material comfort, in order to start developing the virtues and going on to friendship and contemplation, right? All the way through book 10.
Right.
So one wonders if you were to step back for a second, and again, if we're just looking at proportioning means to ends, if command economies don't seem to be that great at allocating material resources, then it seems like they're never going to be on the road to anything further than that, right? Freer markets, right, that actually does put an emphasis on the liberty of the individual agent to pursue their own good, it at least allows for material flourishing. Now, done rightly, it helps you to open up the door to something further that then, all right, with a proper view of the human person, you can start to build the rest of, our virtuous city, right? But it seems like if you never get past the material aspect, then the rest of it doesn't seem to matter. Right. It seems difficult to.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I mean, if you're starving, right, then you're not going to be.
Yeah,
in Aristotelian terms, it's going to be hard to develop an excellent life, right? You have an AI and things, and that seems to me true. But it also seems to me that Sparta didn't starve, and that's not that is a command economy, and they certainly had enough food to be fit for what they did. Now, Sparta's no ideal for other reasons, but I'm also struck by Aristotle saying that while you do need a sufficiency of material goods in order to flourish, he also says you don't need much.
Yeah.
Now there are some virtues that it'd be hard to maybe practice beneficence or magnanimity and some of those things, but even a relatively middling sort can throw a good party for his friends and that kind of thing. Now maybe you can't create a bath for the state or an arch triumph or something like that. But in any event, how do you respond to those?
Actually, I would want to maybe sort of clarify your point just a little bit further, or ask for clarification, because I have a general thought, but I want to make sure that I'm answering to your point. If you could say,
it just again, I guess we're kind of going back and forth here on degrees of efficiency here.
Yeah.
Okay. So granted that it's more efficient, and granted your point that you do need a certain amount of material prosperity in order to flourish. I'm saying you probably don't need much.
Yeah, true.
And that a command economy could. I'm just guessing that there are examples of some command economies that do enough.
Perhaps.
to keep you in the material sufficiency.
Yeah. So it's one of those where it's sort of the double-edged sword, as it were, right? It's like the sort of market economy opens you up to a wider degree of material prosperity. That much doesn't seem to be in question.
I agree with that.
It also opens you up definitely to those people that want to pursue wealth. I mean, that's what they're going to do without qualification. I mean, right. If that is the end to them, right. The difference here, and this is again why I kind of wonder about this notion of you have to have a truly substantial notion of the human good, because we know that, right, the human good isn't something that's that uniform. Right? So Sparta has it's kind of a very specific common good, right? One wonders about the standard of real human flourishing in that sort of structure, right? And it's one of those, I wonder about if it's kind of one of those, a situation that, let's say, to maybe put it in some sort of Thomistic term, that you have to tolerate in order to allow a greater degree of pursuit of goods among the individual agents in a state, right? Because again, all right, so I don't know, maybe as an example, one of the things that market economies make possible that don't seem to be possible, or at least historically weren't in other sorts of economic structures, is the idea of social mobility, right? If you were born to the son of a blacksmith, that's just what you were going to do for the rest of your life, right? And yet in something, one of the things that market economies have done very well, somebody, let's say, that actually is the son of a blacksmith might be brilliant, given the right education, right? Given the right opportunity and given the right freedom of mobility and motion. And then now you have, your next brilliant professor at whatever,
Sure. I mean, that's the upside, right?
Yeah. And I wonder that if, in order to get that upside, this is the idea, right? If there are certain things then that you would have to tolerate, right? Like, so Thomas says and he even Thomas puts it in very strong terms, right? He says there are certain evils that you can tolerate. And I don't think this is necessarily an evil.
Sure.
But right, he says there are certain evils that can be tolerated for the sake of cutting off or precluding a greater
evil, sure.
Evil or something like that. Right. So this is sort of a mirror. Like there are some, like in order to allow for a greater pursuit of the good among various agents, if you just have to allow, some of them are going to stop at that level of just pursuing wealth without qualification. Now,
I'm
there are
worried
things
not so much just about the opportunity loss of social mobility upwards, but what about social mobility downwards? That happens too, right?
It does.
In a market economy, right? I mean, being a blacksmith doesn't look so bad when you lost the blacksmith's position and now you're out there shoveling things. You're like, man, it'd be pretty cool to be a blacksmith again.
Right about now, yeah. Yeah. This is also something interesting too. I've always been struck by, there's this comment that Hayek makes in The Road to Serfdom. And I know people paint Hayek as like this like free market, bare knuckle, no holds barred, whatever, just cutthroat capitalist. And he actually makes this comment in The Road to Serfdom. He says, given this notion of like human dignity, and I don't think he uses that term, but he does say, in a country that is as materially wealthy as the United States, right? This is odd coming from the capitalist, the neo-Austrian capitalist. In a country that is as wealthy as the United States, he says there is no reason that there cannot be some sort of social safety net, right? For those who owing to any number of circumstances, right, find themselves socially moving downwards. Right?
Yeah, sure.
And this happens for all kinds of reasons, right? And so not always necessarily bad, right? So, when the automobile was invented, a lot of horse and buggy stable people, they all found themselves out of a job.
Sure.
Right? I'm not sure that you would want to say, just for the sake of preserving those people's jobs, that we should all give up automobiles, right? And go back to, so something like automation, or even we talk about the division of labor. The more market maybe gets specialized if it does something really well, right? So some people, this is how they kind of end up out of a job, right? Yeah. Now the question is, what can you do concretely about that? And this is where you do have to start being very careful, because you also have to worry about the problem of incentivizing, or maybe I'll phrase it like this, disincentivizing further effort. Right. There are certain, again, you talk about, well, if the state comes in and is mandating X, Y, and Z, or providing all sorts of assistance, you actually are incentivizing people to not go back to school, or not learn a new trade, or not do X, Y, or Z, right? But to just stay on public assistance, right? And it seems like some political parties are making that their entire platform, right? Like, hey, but that comes back to this idea of, well, does the state really like talk about, they're I guess you could say that they're helping people meet a certain material level of good, a certain level of material goods, but in the end, not really, right? You're actually sort of corroding that they call it the human spirit, right? This idea of us being rational animals that can look at problems and apply solutions to given problems, right? This is the spirit of entrepreneurship. Some people fail. This is true, right? And in a society that's as wealthy as ours, right, there are things that we can do about that, right?
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking about this downward mobility, and I maybe want to question more fundamentally if it's really a problem the way we're suggesting it is. Like, it doesn't feel good to move down. Everyone knows that, but I think it's a sort of natural consequence of anything, just like having the freedom to think is, and there's a natural consequence that you might judge falsely, but there's no problem with that. And you get, I'm imagining situations of like Rockefeller going up against, the other railroad guys, and it's provided that he doesn't do anything that's like underhanded. Like he's not setting dynamite on their bridges or something like that,
Right.
And he just outsmarts them because he's a better railroad man. He runs a more efficient railroad. He gets product to people cheaper. He should win, and we win when he wins, right? And the other guy is going to go down, right? He's not going to own railroads anymore. But we're not putting him in a cardboard box necessarily, right?
We were talking about railroad magnets. We were talking about blacksmiths, but yes.
Yeah, all right. But in any case, right? As long as there is I do think there's a certain responsibility that a polis has, because it's necessary for the common good, to produce as much as possible an arrangement where people can secure a livelihood, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily guarantee it. I don't know that we have to go that far, because there's lots of reasons why somebody could, through their own pure imperfection, fail to make it, right? But the guy who was a blacksmith and isn't a blacksmith anymore wishes he was a blacksmith still, but he's not dying. I think that's what I would want to put forward, is that as long as he has opportunity to feed himself, great. Maybe the only problem is that there are other goods that we would, I think, assign normally to people, like the good of marriage and family. And I think that's a pretty contentious one, is that I think most people will be able to find a way to feed themselves, no matter how far they fall. But that raising a family today is quite hard. And that maybe there's a safety net somewhere above the cardboard box that you have to set so that people can still raise a family. But then you start maybe running into problems. I don't know. I'm not sure there's a question in there, but that's what I was thinking about, is that maybe it's not so bad to have this downward mobility possibility.
It's not so bad until you go beyond the limits. You put in the limit, you put in a safety net, right? And so, it's not so bad if there's a safety net. And I will also say, just as a principle, like if you put a floor on that downward mobility, then it's not so bad. If there's no floor, then it can be really bad. And I think ultimately probably gets close to unjust in some cases. And I would also say, just as a matter of I would rather make sure that I'm feeding the orphans and the widows, even if that means I do support a couple of layabouts. Like I'm not happy about there being a couple of layabouts, but you're talking about sort of like tolerating certain evils to pervert to, like all things considered, if a couple, lazy people are just going to take advantage of the system, okay, right?
And some people are always going to take advantage of the system in any respect.
That's right.
Right. Even we were talking about upwards, downwards. People are always going to take advantage of that. It's
kind of like with any kind of charitable endeavor. Of course, that's a little different than what we've been talking about. But like our parish gives away a ton of food, right? And if you ask the priest about it, are there probably some people there who don't really, but I mean, there's so many people who do need it. Who cares? That's kind of on them,
So I would say, because we're talking about this, I was looking the other day at a number of like comparisons between from the 1960s to today, adjusted for inflation for today's dollars, right? And it's true that things are just vastly more expensive now, right? Like the cost of a truck in 1963 in today's dollars would have been about the average cost about $20,000, whereas today it's closer to 60. Right, the average house in 1963 would have been about $165,000 in today's dollars, whereas today the average is about $400,000. Right, whatever. Now there are things, right, the same college education, all of that, but every one of those things, when you kind of first of all, some of the amenities are better, right? Today's trucks have airbags and seat belts, air conditioning, all the things that the truck in 1963 didn't have. Houses are bigger and whatnot.
They're a lot
but in
bigger.
A number of other instances, though, you have excessive, let's say, government regulations that are driving up the prices of some of these things.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. Or when you talked about, charitable contributions, or would you rather support, the orphans and the widows and maybe a couple of layabouts, they kind of, get in under the door, as it were. It still remains true. Again, if you're just looking at, in general, that sense of mechanism, how do we do this best? Still seems like market economies, right? And even when you do stuff like, even when you do things like, so sometimes we do have to incentivize this, right? This is why we have charitable tax written-offs for businesses or whatever, right? But because some of them are out pursuing profit, well, then it happens as kind of a side effect. They're also able to help with these other instances
sure,
far better than it seems like in other concrete examples state interference might be able to. Right? And that's where I still keep kind of coming back. again, just to the notion of the mechanism for the proportion of means to ends. It still seems like no matter where the goal is, it seems like, and I know that this is an argument sometimes I hear in favor of free markets. I don't know that I would want to lean into it too heavily, but part of it seems true, is that even the miser, even Ebenezer Scrooge, since it's Christmas time, right? If he wants to make his fortune, keep his fortune, whatever, he still has to provide some sort of service that people want or need or something like that. And this, right? Want, need, whatever, right? That you even, and they'll say, oh,
which may not be good, right? This goes back to Joe's point earlier, right?
Might not be.
And that's where you can't leave out that formal part of the common good, right? That
this is true.
And
definitely.
I mean, you could be a very effective pornographer, and you're really good at distributing that material, and there people want it.
Yeah.
And
that's that notion of the
ruining
truly
your
good,
soul.
right there. That this is blatantly against something like human flourishing. Even in even the secular world knows this, right? I mean, you see like the studies about what it does to your brain and everything, right? That this is clearly just this is against human flourishing, and so there shouldn't be a market for that. Right.
I liked Joe, your point earlier. I know we've gone long here, just kind of maybe move towards wrapping up, but I liked your point earlier, Joe, about different circumstances, maybe different economic arrangements. We've talked about scales here. You kind of go backwards and forward. Maybe some situations need a little more command. Some situations you need a little. You need more market. That kind of thing. It strikes me that kind of a lot like political regimes. In most cases, because there's no one regime. This is one of the things that I think is brilliant. I love about Aristotle. He doesn't say there's just one regime that's always the best, right? He doesn't have an ideal state, really, right? It's really, for these people, this regime's better, and this regime's better. But most of the time, right, it'll be a polity or some form of mixed regime, right? Will be the best kind of regime, right? And as sort of milquetoasty as this might sound, I've kind of recently been thinking that most of the time, some sort of mixed economy is what we end up arguing for, and then we kind of push one way or the other. I doubt there are very many complete libertarians. I'm sure that there are, and you can find them, but certainly there are not a lot of them, right? Almost everybody I know who's even, goes to the Acton Institute or even goes to von Mises, Institute, right, will still, want a safety net of some sort, and then we argue about the boundaries. One thing that's really interesting is the role of Bismarck in the creation of the modern welfare state, right? Because in a lot of ways, he developed social welfare programs as a response to what he saw as the threat of socialism in Germany. At the time, and he was kind of a conservative, right? And saw these as sort of like an alternative, right? A backstop against, right, these other things. And I kind of I hate to admit this, but I've kind of been wondering recently, is like, this is so terrible to say. Don't hate me for saying it, but maybe the social welfare state isn't that bad after all, right? Now, what I mean by that is a floor, which we've all talked about, some forms of social insurance, right? Albeit less efficient. The nice thing is, it'll be there. Maybe not that great, but it's there, right? And how do you know it's going to be there? Because they can command it, right? It will be there. That deals with some of the externalities we've been talking about, right? But they're called market externalities, right? That maybe the market does a great job with lots of things, and we're happy to have it, especially when it comes to things like pipe tobacco, earphones, and glasses, and stuff like that. But that we do still want that we can achieve a lot of that, but we still need it within a system where there's bounds to it. And it is also important that these markets, there's a reason why laws develop within markets. It's not as if every bureaucrat's just sitting around thinking, oh, damn, what new, rule can I make up, right? Maybe there are people like that, right?
Yeah.
But there's a reason that we have laws, right? And it actually, market economies work best within a strong legal structure, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think, there is that sort of, level. And then especially if we're thinking about our current situation, in which we don't have a virtuous culture, right? We might have to think, kind of like with our founders said much the same thing about the republic, right? That is that you can only really have a republic if we have, religious and virtuous people. And you're like, I don't have religious and virtuous people anymore. So anyways.
So I sort of wondered, I said, I know we're kind of, wrapping up and getting close to that, right? So I would say one, I think I agree. Everything I think you just said. There are things that why I take the approach that I do is one, right? There are very few true libertarians that just have this free for all sort of, to me that sort of sounds like piracy to me, right? It's just absolute cutthroat. I'm gonna take whatever I was like. Well, that doesn't really exist anywhere, right? You have to have a strong legal structure, again, that enforces contracts, that prevents fraud, right? That allows for the justice in exchange. All of that, right? You have to have a strong legal framework. The question is, right, is where do you derive the principle for those laws? Right? And again, I think that only comes from a full-throated, substantive view of the human person and the goodness of the human person. And one of the things that I also think we talked about the social safety net, and that's true too. As long as you also keep in mind, right, it's just been documented over and over and over again that sometimes government protectionism, that sort of interference, it's very often counterintuitive. Whereas on the other hand, if you're in a society that is more market-based, right, that to provide for yourself, you need to get out and get back to work. Right? It doesn't promote laziness. It doesn't promote, any of those other sorts of mentalities, or this lazy mentalities, or recipient welfare mentalities, because well, if I don't get up in the morning, if I'm not industrious, if I'm not entrepreneur, if I don't develop a skill, right, whatever, you're going to end up out on the street, right? And it's kind of the threat of that actually sort of drives that sort of entrepreneurial, industrial type spirit, right? It can help develop virtue in some small respect, at least. And you see this in the writings of the founders too, and a lot of the, oh my goodness, in the Federalist Papers, right? So again, it comes back to that notion of having a real good, a real end in mind, and then looking at the mechanism that's actually best going to help you get there. And a lot of that means looking at the facts kind of on the ground. I think some of the tired old canards of just, repeating like von Mises and a lot of, just repeating market economic principles, that doesn't sway people anymore, right? Repeating 100-year-old papal pronouncements on practical matters when the world is that was over 100 years ago now, right? It's not very helpful, right? And it's not, and it's going back to, again, things like that, it's not going to move the conversation forward in any sort of meaningful respect that's actually going to have a relevant and practical impact on the way that economics is practiced.
I think when it comes to these moral questions, like what sort of system ought we to have, or how we ought to run our economy, I think part of the problem, besides the human good and rightly recognizing that, part of the problem among navigating Catholic conversations of this is that there's a more deontological ethic from the new ethical thinkers in the JP2 school and its sort of progeny, that they just want laws given to them, right? From the top, like this is what Leo said, let's abide by it. This is what is good, right? They want it to be simple, but in practical matters, it's not always so simple, and that sometimes the material considerations really do change what's right in a situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. That's right. I mean, more and more, like when I think about my own political alignment, I try to say, I kind of almost want to say something like I'm a prudentialist. Like, is that a position? Like,
I'm fickle. I change my mind all the
time. Which is really, I mean, it's also circumstantial. It's not that it's also circumstantial. The principles, the eternal law, divine law, natural law, are permanent and abiding. But, at the same time, the space between, I would say, the natural law and the ground is wider than people think, getting from, okay, I know the natural law principles, pretty well, getting from there, right, even maybe having a well-developed idea of the common good, it's going to look different in like 13th century Norway than it's going to look in 21st century America, wildly different, right? And that, I think that, prudence and virtue give you the space in which to navigate that. Well, that's great, Phil. Thanks so much for your insights and for sharing what your research with us. Has a lot of great. I mean, so many great topics that could keep going.
This is true. We can do this all afternoon.
We should keep going.
Thank you for having me. This has been wonderful talking to you guys about this. And I enjoy it.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe, for participating. Everybody in our audience, thanks for listening. We really appreciate it. Please do make sure that you, if you haven't done so yet, to subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the like button, and do all those other good social media things you're supposed to do. Thanks so much. Until next time, God bless.